Hello, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. If you can see. Hello.
Hi,
Hi.
Jeffrey. I can see your names. Hi, Hilary. Lovely to meet you. Hi. Hi, and we've got James, Sarah, and Neil Jennings on the line as well. Glad you could all join us. We'll get started shortly. We're expecting a few more people. Not sure if, but isn't that lovely? I mean, you're in gallery view and we've got a full screen on Zoom, which is really nice.
It is. It is nice. Okay, let me...
Is everyone from Australia?
Good question. I honestly don't know.
We had a few RSVPs from Canada, so the very that's pretty cool because that's a different.
Yeah,
that's keen.
That's a
time zone.
Yeah.
And Mads, you're also from San Francisco at this point in time. Clearly.
Yeah.
The background.
Enjoying the cloudy, misty day. Yeah. It's much in Melbourne.
So we've just got. I just got a Zoom chat from Sarah. She's down in Melbourne in lockdown.
Good on you guys.
All right. Well, look. Why don't we kick things off? Thanks for joining, everyone. My name's Rebecca Barry, and I'm the co-founder of Media Stockade, who co-produced the film Disaster Capitalism. Before I kick things off, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia. I'm dialing in from Camaragal land of the Guringai tribe of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And for those of you who are in Australia, if any of you are keen to put in the chat function which country you're dialing in from today, we'd love to see where you're from. Yes, so that's my acknowledgement to this lovely country that we live in and have the privilege of living in. So just a little bit of housekeeping to start with. We are recording the event, and if you'd prefer to stay anonymous, I would just take a lot of you have done that anyway, but just take your video off and keep it to audio only so that we can't see you. And this is just for people who couldn't make it. We had a few more RSVPs, so we'll make sure that people can have access to it later on. We'd also ask everyone to put their mute button on when they're not talking. We're going to have the Q&A happening via the chat function. So for all of you who are a bit newish to Zoom, I'm sure we've all become professionals over this lockdown period, but there's the chat box down the bottom. If you click on that, you can type in to everybody if you've got any questions, and we will be going to those questions throughout the discussion with Anthony. And if you have any technical difficulties, we've got Carolina she's got the Media Stockade icon over there. So if you wanted to you could send a chat to Carolina and the Media Stockade icon, and she'll help you with any technical issues. So great to have you. Oh, I've just seen we've got Neil from. He's on the coast, the Salish coast, which is Musqueam, Squashing, in the Tasilis Water Territory in Canada. Wow. Well, I've never heard that. Welcome. Thanks for coming. That's awesome. And we've got more people from Camaragal, which is where I'm from as well, which is where I'm born and bred. Okay. Well, look, why don't we get started into the get the show started. Here we are. As I mentioned, I'm Rebecca Barry, co-founder of Media Stockade and the newly formed Doc Lovers Club. So this is the first Doc Lovers Club. We're planning on having them every month, where we invite people to watch a film, and then we invite a special guest along. And in this case, we've got Antony Loewenstein, and he is the writer and co-producer of Disaster Capitalism, which I hope you've all had a chance to watch. He's a Sydney-based journalist. He's written for all of these amazing titles such as the New York Times, The Guardian, the BBC, Washington Post, HuffPost, and many others. He's written numerous books, Pills, Powder and Smoke, Inside the Bloody War on Drugs, that's his most recent books, and also Disaster Capitalism, Making a Killing Out of Catastrophe. He also has a great newsletter if you wanted to go onto his website and sign up for that. And he, as I mentioned before, is the writer and co-producer. The film was directed by Thor Neureiter and edited by the amazing Leah Donovan. So Antony, going over to you, could you give us a bit of an introduction about how Disaster Capitalism, the film, came about?
About 10 years ago, actually, let me first start off by thanking everybody for coming. I wanted to thank Media Stockade for organising this, Rebecca and Madeline and Carolina for doing this. It's a great opportunity to talk about the issues which I wish were not so relevant, but sadly they've never been more relevant. And we'll explain soon about how the film, although it came out 2 years ago, apart from a few leaders have come and gone, the issues have not changed at all. In fact, they've become even more topical particularly this year in the COVID moment that we're in. So about 10 years ago, I started working on the book, Disaster Capitalism, and the film kind of came out of that. The film is not a direct adaptation of the book, but the issues are related. So essentially the idea of people and corporations making money from misery, why that happens, how it happens, and where it happens. And there are obviously a million examples of where I could have shown that. And I wanted to particularly focus for the film, and I partnered with Thor in 2012. We decided in the end to focus on 3 countries, Afghanistan, Haiti, and Papua New Guinea. Those 3 places are also in the book, and I've also featured other countries in the book as well. And I guess they're 3 examples because certainly as an Australian and Thor as an American didn't know much about PNG. It's not a criticism of him, it's just the fact that PNG gets almost no coverage in Australia, let alone globally. It is a country of such stunning beauty, but also it's a broken country. It's been independent of Australia in names for 40 odd years, but it's really arguably an offshoot of Australian colonialism still to this day. And I wanted to focus on the mining issue there, Afghanistan, because it's the longest war now in American history, longest war in Australian history, 20 years next year. And it's been a complete disaster, and we'll get to why that is, although that's not exactly a breaking news story. And Haiti, because it's a close neighbor of America, it gets a lot of coverage to some extent after a massive earthquake. And the film talks about the aftermath of a 2010 earthquake and the failed aid effort, mostly from the then Obama administration, but also how a country globally is sort of treated almost as a second-class citizen that I think many of us realize, and the book and film research really highlighted that for me, that there are a lot of countries that much of the world likes to keep on the aid drip feed. That's the point. It's done from a colonial mindset in a way that essentially says that a country like Haiti, or you could list 50 or 60 other countries, if not more, we like the fact that you're kind of on life support and we're going to make a decision whether you live or die. So that's some of the process, although it was the filming was complicated. We went to every country twice each over a space of about 5 years. Thor and I went to some of the places together. I went to all of them, and a few other people came along to shoot along the way to film. These countries are hard to navigate. Sometimes they're dangerous, they're expensive, much more than you'd think, having fixers and that kind of thing. Fixers, for those who don't know, is a local person who helps you in the field with translations and transport, etc. And then we partnered with Media Stockade in 2015. So it's been a long process, but worthwhile in the end.
And by the way, everyone, please, if at any point you have a question to ask Antony, please do put it into the chat function. We're really keen to to get your questions. So Antony, we've got, you know, this film was released in 2017, and yet it's scarily still more relevant than it was even back then. And we've obviously had a lot of changes happening, including we've got, you know, Trump is in power. What's actually changed since this film has been released?
The film actually came out in 2018, Beck, just to...
Oh, sorry.
No, that's all right. That's all right. So it's been 2 years, came out 2 years ago, just over 2 years. I think it was May 2018, if I remember roughly. Let me give a brief rundown for those hopefully who've seen the film, and those who haven't, there'll be the chance obviously afterwards hopefully to watch it. In Afghanistan, what's changed is there are now less US troops. Trump has engaged in a so-called peace process between the Afghan government and the Taliban, with the US being kind of like I hate to use the word father figure because that's quite colonial in that context, but kind of like an assistant to that process. There is a peace process, which I have to say, and I'm far from a supporter of Trump, and that'll be very clear for this hour and anyone who knows my work. But Trump actually, more than Obama, more than Bush, actually, or some people around him have pushed for some kind of end to that war. And the war won't end by the November election. There's obviously a US election in about 2 months. But there'll be less US troops. And a lot of Afghan friends of mine who are both in Afghanistan and elsewhere are really scared of what that could mean. They don't think there should be endless US troops for the next 20, 30, 40 years, although I fear that there will be. But what they fear is a vacuum, a power vacuum. It's happened in the past in that country where US or foreign forces leave, and essentially it's just allowed to have a free-for-all between the Taliban, between more extreme forces, ISIS and others, Al-Qaeda. And that's a worry. And that's a legitimate worry because the violence in both Kabul and the rest of the country is soaring. I don't think a lot of people really realize the complete and utter security violent reality for people. I mean, friends of mine in Kabul regularly say to me, when we leave our house in the morning to go to work, we don't know if we're going to come home. Are we going to be killed by a suicide attack on the way to work, waiting at a food shop, whatever it may be? And that kind of reality, I think, is hard for a lot of us in the West to really understand. It is quite existential. So the war is, I would argue, not going to end anytime soon. One of the things the film also addresses, of course, just briefly, is the mining issue. And one of the reporting I've done since the film came out, and people can find this online if they Google it, a lot of work on Eric Prince, who is the founder of Blackwater, the military contractor trying to get influence with the Trump administration to access Afghanistan's resources, its mineral resources. The summary of what's happened to that is not a lot since the film came out. There are still $3 to $4 billion of resources under the ground. The security situation makes it almost impossible to do much about that. So as a country, it's kind of stuck in almost a limbo. And what I and many Afghans do hope, though, is that a viable peace process does continue, because otherwise you have this middle of the ground reality where this war just drags on for another 10, 20, 30 years and forgotten until there's another attack in a Western city, and then the US goes back into it and either re-invades or reoccupies with 100,000 troops. In Haiti, very briefly, the country still has the same leader as a few years ago. Violence has skyrocketed. Corruption has gone through the roof. There's been massive public protests against that. Not much has changed on the ground. The areas that we visit in the film are still really in bad shape. A lot of those slums are worsening. The Trump administration doesn't really care about Haiti. That's not exactly a breaking news headline, but not much has happened between the US and Haiti since to change that, as we say in the film, toxic relationship. I suppose the only positive maybe that's come out of these three countries is in Bougainville in Papua New Guinea. And the film touches on the build-up to this independence vote. It did happen in 2019. 98% of Bougainvilleans supported independence. So now the question is, what happens? The vast majority of people there want the country to separate from PNG. There was an election recently held. There'll be a new leader in Bougainville announced this year. More likely he than she, will have to negotiate with PNG and frankly also Australia at whether Bougainville is allowed to be independent. I mean, you think if they have a vote, that's a given. But PNG is not a fan of Bougainville being independent, and neither was Australia, frankly. Because in their view, they want to keep access to the resources from a Western mining company, whether it's Rio Tinto or others. And they fear that if Bougainville becomes independent, their ability to influence that industry will be much limited. So I'd say that's, well, the independent side's a positive aspect. The reality on the ground in Bougainville is still a very, very poor country. And the environmental destruction which you see in the film so viscerally has not been cleaned up. And frankly, at the moment, there's no indication that it will be.
Yeah, gosh, it's it's still so complicated, isn't it? And I think one of the, speaking of Papua New Guinea, we're in a very interesting point in time where Australia is essentially the ham and the sandwich between, USA and China and the power and who is going to, basically control the Pacific. Do you have any comments on that? I mean, given that Bougainville and PNG is just so resource rich, and so dysfunctional and so problematic, like how vulnerable are they going to be with all the changes that are happening on an international level?
What's happening in the last 10 years, and obviously I'm hardly the only one who's looked into this, is there has been a real shift in Beijing's attitude towards the Pacific, that they're obviously become a much more powerful country. They're now either the second most powerful country in the world or arguably the most powerful. I think in some ways the US still is the most powerful, and that will remain even if Trump, God help us, gets a second term. America's influence and power is not going to decline that quickly in the next 4 years. So China is very cleverly, from its perspective, done a lot of soft power, buying a lot of influence in the Pacific, a lot of aid projects, and Papua New Guinea is part of that. And Australia is scared of that, to be honest. So one of the arguments about why Australia wants to maintain influence in PNG, apart from the Bougainville issue and mining, is the refugee question. Now, obviously, there are not many refugees stuck on Manus Island or in Port Moresby anymore. There are only a handful. But what is there, and what Australia wants to maintain, is a number of increasing military bases in PNG as almost a presence to be against perceived Chinese influence or aggression. Not that there has been Chinese aggression, but a perception that there might be in time. And you can only presume a conversation between Washington and Canberra, which says, you in Canberra need to step up your anti-China rhetoric. And as you said before, Rebecca, that puts Australia in a very, very complicated position. I think if Joe Biden wins the upcoming election in the US, and we'll talk about that a bit later, I think the anti-China rhetoric from Washington will definitely decrease. I don't think that's going to continue. Of course, if Trump wins, we're in a whole uncharted territory. But I think if Biden wins, there will be an attempt by that new White House to kind of, to some extent, soften that relationship, because it actually benefits nobody, really, for there to be not necessarily a military war, but even a war of words. It doesn't really benefit anybody particularly. I mean, it benefits some companies making money, but in general, it doesn't. So you're right. I think Australia, in general, is much more happy and comfortable being a supporter of the US position rather than the Chinese one, of course. But also Australia is so reliant on Chinese trade. I mean, that has not changed. And although China is increasingly, as people will be aware, trying to curtail Australia's influence in China, I do like to think, more hope than maybe reality, that relationship can be repaired. I mean, ultimately, of course, when it comes down to it, you have two fundamentally different political systems. China is one of the most authoritarian nations on the planet, with a surveillance state beyond rival, and Australia, which is kind of a quasi-democratic capitalist system, doing, in terms of the COVID moment, relatively well compared to much of the world, and has no interest in following the Chinese model. So yes, I think Bougainville is potentially going to be a meat and a sandwich. And as we say in the film, just finally, there is an interest by Chinese companies to get ownership of that mine. At the moment, they don't have ownership of it. Bougainville, I think, if they're independent, will be torn between a Western mining company like a Rio Tinto and frankly a Chinese one. And I wonder which way they would go. The Chinese one, I suspect, would have a pretty good shot, to be frank.
Mm. You've mentioned COVID, and we've got a question come in from Jeffrey in Melbourne. So, assuming the discovery of a vaccine, how do you see disaster capitalism playing into getting the vaccine to poor countries? We're obviously in the middle of another disaster, that being COVID.
Mm. The vaccine question is so interesting. And I mean, the short answer is that many of us who would take a vaccine, I don't know if I'd be the first in line to do so necessarily. There's real questions at the moment, as I'm sure a lot of people will be aware, of the risk of a rushed vaccine. That is a real serious risk that there is already, and some people might be aware of these issues and some might not be, that there is a really surging confluence of, I don't want to say conspiracy theories, but that's kind of what they are, particularly online, on Facebook, etc., around issues to do with vaccines, 5G towers. And not everyone believes these, of course, but one of the things that I think people are maybe less aware of, who don't engage so much with online media, particularly in the age of, I would say, much more extremism online, is that a lot of, I recommend people to read a guy called, what's on the New York Times journalist, that to cover this kind of issue, is that a lot of the information that many people are getting now about the vaccine question is far misinformation, I should say, is far more popular than truthful information. And an issue around conspiracy theories is how much easier it is for conspiracy theories to thrive on social media platforms than so-called truthful information. And one of the challenges that many respected medical organizations have is they have really in some ways left the field until more recently to actually say, we do need to make an argument for a vaccine. In other words, having a vaccine that is safe is a legitimate issue. It's also fair to ask, will the vaccine be safe? I mean, I support vaccines. My children are vaccinated. A lot of people I know vaccinate their kids. Most people, in fact, vaccinate their kids. But it's a legitimate question to ask. Will the vaccine be safe? And if it's not safe and it's put into market and people are either pressured to take it, or there are serious side effects, or it goes badly, just imagine the impact that's going to have on the take-up of other vaccines for lots of other issues. So that sort of thing, I think, is a real question. And just briefly, in terms of disaster capitalism in poorer countries, one of the concerns that I have is access to the vaccine anyway. I mean, at the moment, you have a situation where just this week, the Trump administration said that they won't participate with the World Health Organization in allowing the distribution and research into a vaccine. So what does that mean? Does that mean that Australians and Americans and Canadians and much of Europe will get a vaccine if it exists? Possibly, probably. Western richer countries? Possibly. What does that mean for vast parts of the world? India, Brazil, lots of other countries where I fear that the access to the vaccine is limited. And then, of course, you have two tiers of society. When and if travel restarts again around the world, are we going to have a vaccine passport, a COVID vaccine passport? I mean, we already live in a very class-obsessed society, and I think because we have lots of issues with class in Australia and around the world. But the idea that you start having various tiers of people, who's safe, who's not safe, who's got a vaccine, who doesn't, and certainly in poor countries, it's almost a non-starter, right? I mean, how is someone in PNG or Afghanistan or Haiti going to get access to a vaccine unless the government pays for it? I mean, in those countries, most people can't afford literally barely putting food on the table, let alone a vaccine. So what worries me, there's so much of the coverage around this issue in the West in the last 6 months has not ignored the non-Western world, but too often it does. And I worry that finally an unsafe vaccine, and I might add there's some evidence that there's some vaccine testing being done in parts of Africa, which on the face of it is not by definition problematic, although sadly, as some people will be aware, there's a very dark history of people of color having vaccines tested on them, both in the US and particularly in Australia for that matter, actually, and also in Africa, to see if the vaccine is safe. That's pretty concerning, to put it mildly.
Yeah, it certainly is. When we were chatting the other day, you talked about other disasters or emergencies that are currently unfolding, and you touched on it a bit just then when you were talking about social media, and you described social media as a global emergency, and I wanted to sort of dig a bit deeper into that, about what you actually meant by that, and how does that play into this concept of disaster capitalism?
Look, there's, just to explain what I mean, but to people, I don't suggest that, everyone who uses Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, which is frankly at least a third of the world's population, if not more, are bad people. I use those tools myself for work, to share information, etc. So I'm not saying that, everyone who uses them is evil, far from it. What I am saying, though, and what I'm arguing, and the evidence for this is overwhelming, particularly Facebook, they are often literally enablers of mass violence or genocide. And if people don't believe that, they can Google, for example, the role of Facebook in Myanmar in the last 5 years in mass violence, if not genocide, against the Rohingya. Facebook was a central player in not just enabling hate against the Rohingya population, who I might add is still stateless, but Facebook as an organization was not just slow to deal with hate, but even to this day, barely takes it seriously. In the Philippines, a country that I went to a few years ago for my recent drug war book, Duterte, incredibly smartly from his perspective, has weaponized Facebook. So in a country where I think it's about 97% of people get their information from Facebook, that doesn't mean everything is a Facebook source, but it means that they're getting stuff that they read on Facebook. The power of that organization is unbelievable. I mean, just think about that. I mean, it's huge. And one thing I learned in the research of that, which I must say I was not aware of, and doesn't get much attention, is that whenever there's an election going on in a country, and that's less of a problem potentially in a Western country, but say the Philippines, the election was happening in 2016, Facebook themselves send teams of people to assist the campaigns that are running for the election. So they sent people to the Philippines to assist Duterte's campaign and his opposition. And you have to ask yourself, okay, so they're helping Duterte, who during the election at the time was already calling for mass violence against drug users. Duterte wins the election in 2016, and he's scheduled to leave office in a couple of years, assuming that actually happens. And to this day, and there's been some great reporting on this in BuzzFeed of people, I referenced it in my recent book, people can Google that if they're keen to learn more, about how Facebook has been complicit in not just demonization of critics in the Philippines, but the silencing of them. There are countless other examples in other countries, and not least in the US at the moment. And there's been a lot of great reporting in the New York Times about this in the last few months, about how there is literally for a lot of people a parallel universe, alternate universe about what information one consumes. There has never been a time in history, I think, when that has happened on such mass scale. So in the US, for example, in most days, at least 2/3 of the top Facebook posts that are going viral, I'm talking about with millions and millions of views, are misinformation now about, say, COVID, or racist stuff against, African Americans, or whatever that may be. There's a range of other examples. And it's a complete parallel universe. In other words, you and I don't see those posts. Probably most of our friends aren't posting those posts. You can find them if you want to. They're not secret, but you and I don't see them because we don't follow people who post them. And I'm not for a second suggesting Facebook should be shut down. I think that ship sailed years ago. It's not shutting down. But there seems to be still, to this day, I cannot think of really any country that has seriously tried to regulate these corporations. I mean, break them up. Elizabeth Warren, to her credit, and Bernie Sanders during the US election campaign talked about trying to do that. Would Joe Biden do that if he's president? I mean, is he even going to be alive in 6 months? I mean, he looks so sort of decrepit. God knows, right? He has to win first, which is frankly a big if you ask me. So yeah, a lot of people are now worried about social media extremism, and I'm less concerned, as so many in the media are, about Russian interference. The Russian interference issue is really a bit of a red herring. Yes, the Russians influenced the 2016 election. Yes, they bought Facebook ads to help Trump. Yes, they're going to meddle this year, as are China and Iran for that matter. But this idea somehow that so many on the left and Hillary supporters told themselves for the last 4 years that essentially, Putin and Trump is Putin's person, and it's thanks to Putin that Trump won. It's absolute nonsense. There's no evidence for that. There's evidence that Russia had influence. I'm not suggesting they don't. And I'm not for a second supporting Putin. Putin is a malevolent, awful autocrat, to be sure. But this idea somehow that the strings are solely being pulled by Putin and people around him, these issues go far, far beyond a Russian disinformation campaign. And that worries me. And at the moment, yes, there are people like me and frankly others who are more experienced than I talking about this, but Facebook itself, and I'll finish on this point, Facebook is kind of the classic example of an organization that will regularly say, as they do when they get asked this question, the vast majority of people who use Facebook are doing it to share dog pictures or kid pictures with their kids or grandkids. That may well be true. I've got no problem with that. Although obviously the advertising aspect is a concerning thing, but putting that issue aside, but how do you account for the fact that they are complicit in genocide? They're not pulling the trigger. They're not Mark Zuckerberg's not personally killing Rohingya people, sure, but their tools are complicit in those kinds of violence. And that to me is something that much of us haven't really come to terms with.
We've got a couple of questions coming through about this issue. Madeline's talking about, will we see successful regulation brought into the big social platforms? Who is working to achieve that? And Daria O'Neill has just also added to that same topic, what can we use as an alternative? I mean, we're all addicted, right?
The answer to the second question is a difficult one. I mean, there obviously are other social media platforms. I mean, the problem is a lot of people aren't on them. I mean, a lot of people communicate via other ways, use email, good old-fashioned email instead of look, for many of us, for example, for me, it's still an invaluable tool to not just promote my work, but to converse with people because everybody's on it. I mean, the argument that says, and there was this campaign last year, people will remember, was it log off Facebook or something, or delete your account. And on the one hand, I understand that temptation. On the other hand, I say to people, okay, you have the luxury potentially of doing that, living in a Western country. The truth is, for vast numbers of people around the world, Facebook is the internet. That is the internet. That is the entire way that people communicate online, sending messages to friends, reading about news, whatever it may be. It's vast parts of the world. I mean, for example, in India, a lot of the Facebook-enabled mobile phones have come preloaded just with Facebook. Shock horror. Of course they do. Like that's the system. So yes, you could delete Facebook and get rid of it tomorrow. Not that that's going to happen. What happens to all those people? Many of whom undeniably are benefiting from the use of Facebook to communicate with their family, with their friends, especially the people who are the poorest of the world. So I'm not saying, as I said before, everything about Facebook is evil. What I am saying is that without, as Madeline rightly asked, where's the regulation going to come from? To me, I don't see a way around this apart from breaking the companies up. I just don't see it. I don't see how you get around this issue without doing that. Who's pushing for that? I mean, Trump sort of jumps up and down and says he hates it. But the truth is, and he knows this because his people would tell him, the most popular posts on Facebook in the US are pro-Trump by a mile. And that's why many people now argue that in some ways is Facebook this so-called silent majority that Trump talks about that's going to win him the election. I'm not saying it will be. I guess we're going to find out in a few months. But it's a legitimate question to ask. I think there is going to be pressure if Biden wins to do something seriously about Facebook in the US and Twitter and others for that matter. The EU is trying and has tried over the years to control some influence of Google and others. As I'm sure people will be aware, in Australia, there is a current fight now between Facebook and Google and the Australian government, where Facebook threatened this week that they say, if you dare make us pay you money, we're going to take off the ability for Australians to share news on our platform. Now, I don't actually know what that even practically means. I mean, what does that actually mean? That means what? How do they know whatever URL is going to be that's a news story, for one? It's a threat which my guess will not come through. And I think what the Australian government is trying to do, in my view, in a typically ham-fisted way to try to help their mates in the Murdoch press, I've got no problem trying to get more money from Google or Facebook. Tax them. Make them pay tax in the country. And more importantly, have a media fund that a lot of organizations, small and big, can get access to. I mean, Australian media was already in crisis before COVID. Now we're, 6 months into it, and there are countless organizations that have gone bust, many others that are going to go bust. And it's very possible to me within 5 years that you have even less serious media players. Murdoch will still be around, some version of Fairfax and Nine will still be around, The Guardian will probably be around, ABC will be around, SBS. I don't see them disappearing, but it's important, I'll finish on this point, that the fund that the government's trying to set up when they get money from Facebook or Google, that money was not going to go to the public broadcasters, SBS or ABC, who frankly need it far more than Rupert Murdoch to buy another yacht in the Mediterranean. I mean, what is going on? I mean, we know what's going on, but it's still outrageous.
Yeah, it is outrageous. So look, bring it back to the Australian context and, you know, the current disaster that we're in with COVID. We're seeing, you've mentioned the media industry, we're seeing the government actively bringing in legislation and, a hiatus on the licensing for broadcasters and the relaxing of quotas, that sort of thing. What are and we're also seeing, we're talking about economic recovery now that we're in this recession, and that gas is a potential solution to getting us out of this recession. What are your comments about what the current government's doing under this current disaster that we're in?
You know, one of the definitions of disaster capitalism really is waiting for the right time to push things you wanted to push for years. Like, when is that right moment? And for people who are pushing for a so-called gas-led recovery or an attempt to move away from supposed fossil fuels and embrace not coal, gas was seen as the savior. Well, it's not the savior. And I fear that what the Australian government's doing, the federal government, I mean, is pushing a so-called gas-led recovery. Gas is not a clean energy, for one. There's also serious questions about our ability to compete on a global market with gas, 2. And 3, one issue I've been thinking a lot about recently and hope to do something about soon is that I shouldn't say we all agree on this. A lot of people agree that we need to transition to 100% renewables. And most people say that it could be quite achievable if we wanted to in Australia within 10 years tops. I don't see that happening with the current political makeup in the country, but it's possible. And I support that. However, the caveat though is, and what concerns me about so much of this debate about a so-called green revolution, which has to happen and should happen, is that there's still a climate change impact of, for example, switching to electric cars. Now, on the face of it, you would say, well, using dirty energy for a car is bad. Using electric car is good. The argument to that is it's better than a petrol-powered car. But what a lot of people don't realise, and this is something that I think needs to get a lot more attention, is what is in an electric car's battery, particularly cobalt and lithium, is an unbelievably ugly and dirty energy source. And how does that cobalt and lithium, where does it come from? Cobalt particularly is mined particularly in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Lithium is coming from places like Peru and elsewhere, in Australia, I might add. It's very carbon intensive. The human rights abuses in the Democratic Republic of Congo are off the chart. So again, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't do anything. I'm not arguing this, therefore, let's just stay with dirty energy. Not at all. I'm saying let's not believe a utopian solution to this is simply transitioning to electric cars, for example. And many of us probably think, well, electric cars are better. Yes, they're probably better than the current cars that we have now. Most of them, of course, are using petrol. And that's very, very dirty. But I think there's too little discussion. I think there's too many of us who embrace, rightly so, 100% transition to renewables without thinking about the fact that that doesn't mean, therefore, there's not a carbon cost on it. There's not a climate change impact, let alone a human rights impact. And that worries me. It worries me that there is almost blinkers on this issue. And disaster capitalism does play into that, because a lot of the companies that are trying to mine cobalt or lithium in many developing or poor countries are exploiting people no end. And yet we, for good, about the fact that we're using an electric car in Sydney or LA or New York or London. That makes us feel good about ourselves. And yet we thought about the amount of people who are potentially suffering to get that. And yes, there are moves by many people now to make a conflict-free lithium or cobalt. It is possible, but at the moment, and I might also add, of course, cobalt's in most of our mobile phones as well. And again, I'm not, avoiding that. I use a mobile phone 1,000 times a day. So I'm not sort of, preaching from the mount here to say, everyone here is bad and I'm good. We're all part of the problem. I suppose it's more just making people less utopian about what a transition looks like and being aware of the fact that there is a cost. There always is a cost.
Guys, if anyone has any questions, please do go ahead and put some more put them into the chat function there. I'm monitoring it. So how about, I'd love to hear comments about some of the corporations, the corporate elites that have thrived under this current disaster of COVID, Amazon. What are your comments around that scenario?
Well, there are some people who've done very well. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, is a very happy man. I mean, maybe he's not happy, but he certainly is very wealthy. I can't speak if he's happy, but he's wealthy. I think he was the first person to ever become a $200 billion person, and he's likely to become a trillionaire, which is sort of crazy to imagine. Amazon stocks and Amazon, his wealth has shot up this year because more so in the US than elsewhere, Amazon has become the place you get everything. I mean, Australia's Amazon is obviously big here, but it's not the same as the US. So a lot of people in America, they are getting all their groceries and whatever else from Amazon. So I always encourage people who want to buy my books or others, if you can avoid Amazon, please try to support your local independent bookshop, unless there's no alternative, in which case, fine, but try to avoid. Jeff Bezos does not need your money, believe me. He's doing very well without it. Another interesting case in the US particularly is the healthcare question, which of course is central to, in some ways, this upcoming US election. And the reason the healthcare question is relevant and private insurers to the COVID moment is that in much of the US to this day, in early September 2020, to get a test for COVID is either impossible or the results take 2 to 4 weeks to get back. I mean, think about this. If you get your results in 4 weeks, what's the point of it? What is the actual point of getting a COVID test a month after you have the test? It's insane. I mean, it's sort of obvious to say that, but it needs to be said. It's crazy. So not surprisingly, a lot of the private insurers and wealthy around the US have access to quick testing, results back within 24 hours. That's actually a pretty important part of what this means. There's a lot of companies like that who are doing incredibly well, very, very well, in fact. I think there's also a real question here about, as I said before, the energy issue. I mean, the companies that are not doing as well are the fossil fuel companies, weirdly enough, who already had troubles economically before the pandemic. Yes, oil is not about to disappear tomorrow, neither is coal, unfortunately. They're going to be around for many years to come. But they're suffering because a lot of people need, frankly, less oil and less gas and less fuel because they're not going anywhere as much. So they're struggling. And what they're trying to do at the moment, the Exxons and Shells and others, and they've been doing this before the COVID moment, but they're doing it even more now, is imagining what a potentially oil-free world looks like. What does that actually look like for a company that has made its fortune with oil? I mean, what does it look like? It's still arguably decades away. And there was a really disturbing story recently in the New York Times about this very issue, saying that in Africa, what a lot of these companies are now trying to do is imagine a world where they are both producing and shipping massive amounts of plastic to Africa. Now, it's not going to replace oil and other resources, but they are imagining what a future looks like that does not simply require the discovery and distribution of a resource, which, despite what Trump is saying, the transition to renewables is happening. I mean, it's almost like in many US states that are Democrat-led, they've ignored the White House in the last 4 years, and they're slowly but surely moving to a renewable future. To me, it's inevitable that this will happen. And finally, I'd say also what's been really worrying is to see, and you saw this particularly when you have crazy bushfires in California, Australia, is there's going to be a growth of things like private firefighters. I mean, that sort of reality is coming where, if there's a massive bushfire, that can you rely on the state provided fire service? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. If you have your private firefighting service who just is working for you and 10 other clients in the area, doesn't mean your house won't burn down, but your chances are higher. Hiring private security around your home if there is a potential of a bushfire or some other event, a serious seismic event. It's I think one of the things that often comes up with this question is that I think, and I thought this with my book on the drug war last year, Disaster Capitalism as well, everything really comes down to class. It just comes down to class and wealth. I mean, that really is what it comes down. Who's got it and who doesn't? And those who have it, who are worried about the climate change catastrophe which is coming, hopefully is averted, but I'm not all that optimistic at the moment. In the short term, they're going to be doing fine. They're not going to be worried about losing their home in Bangladesh. They're not going to be caring about that now in the short term. They're able, at least for now, to be able to mitigate, I guess, climate change risk and frankly also make money from it. In the long run, I'm not so sure, but in the short term, I think they're doing very, very well.
Unmute myself. So we've got a question. Got a question from Sarah Jacob, who says, "Hi Antony, when I interviewed you in June after Virtual Progress, you spoke about the trend of selling off public assets as a legacy of Reagan and Thatcher's politics. Only a month later, Josh Frydenberg publicly expressed his fondness for Reagan and Thatcher. Given that privatising public services reduces accountability and transparency, do you think Frydenberg's ideology will find support from the Australian public?"
Well, that is a good question. I guess the test will be the next election, won't it? But I also would say that, do we think Labor is all that different? There are differences. And I mean, I'm not the sort of person who says, for example, that Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese would be the same. And I would definitely not say, for example, that Trump is the same as Biden. They're not. Or Jeremy Corbyn was definitely not the same as Boris Johnson. Not that worked out too well in the UK for Corbyn. But, what's happened, I think, in Australia in the last decades, and it's followed what's happening in many other countries, is a gradual sell-off, not just of public assets, but a giving over of public services, prisons, immigration facilities, others, to private interests. A lot of people don't realise that Australia is the only country in the world that has privatised its entire immigration detention network. I mean, obviously the decisions about who comes to Australia and not are made by the Immigration Department. But all the facilities, both onshore and in Nauru and Manus Island, are run by private companies for profit, whether it was Serco in years past, G4S, many, many others. And, I think if you ask a lot of Australians these questions, and there's been studies about this, about how do you feel about our assets or these assets or the most vulnerable people being managed or abused by private interests, people, most of them don't like that. But what are they doing about it? And ultimately, I'd say the Liberal Party, and not all the Labor Party, but most, are kind of on a how do I say this? They've been on a joint ticket on this. I mean, do we think, for example, the Labor Party has been against privatising immigration centres? No. I mean, are they reversing it when they're in power? No. There's not much of a difference there. And that's the sort of sad duopoly, I think, of bipartisan support. People often sort of say, there's too much fighting in politics. No. The problem is there's not enough fighting. The problem is the actual opposite of that. There's too much furious agreement. People get seduced by what they see in the media. Everyone's fighting in Parliament. No. They're fighting for it's theatre. Of course, there are differences. Again, I'm not saying they're the same. There are differences between Labor and Liberal on some issues. For sure there are. But on a lot of the key foundational institutional issues in the country, there's unbelievable agreement between the two major sides of politics. And how do you break that? A successful third party, a public campaign against a particular issue that interests people, whether it's immigration detention or whatever it may be. So to finally answer Sarah's question, will Frydenberg's wet dream of Thatcher and Reagan win the day? Well, I think he was doing it partly to troll his audience, frankly. So, I mean, although I'm sure he believes it, but I think he was trying to troll, and probably quite successfully, because we're talking about it months after. But I'd say in the short term, at least, Thatcher and Reagan did win, because their policies have been adopted in many, many Western countries. And we see the reality of that in developing countries in the film.
We've got another question from Daria O'Neill. Speaking of privatisation, do you have any intel on why it seems impossible to establish effective waste management recycling schemes in Australia? Superficially, seems like there would be lots of money to be made. So why isn't this happening?
That is a very good question. I don't really know the answer to that. I do know what's happened in the last years, though, is that for many, many years, a lot of countries, including Australia, sent most of our crap to China. And there was massive, massive landfill in China. And I know in the last few years, China has refused to take that landfill, and it's now going elsewhere. In terms of why there's so much ineffective waste management here, I'll let someone else who's done much more research on that speak. I honestly don't know the answer to that. It frustrates me, but it's not my, I guess, area of expertise. So I'm not really sure. There was an interesting Four Corners a few years ago about this. It's basically saying a lot of the recycling efforts in Australia are kind of a farce because they actually don't really get recycled. So I'd encourage people maybe to watch that. I don't know if that gave, I forget all the details, but it was sort of, my recollection was that story basically said that the whole recycling waste management issue was kind of like a bit of a boys' club, and there was not really a lot of. Again, we feel good about ourselves when we sort of separate all, our garbage every week. Now there's like bottles here and rubbish there, and I do that too. I'm not dismissing it, but I always wonder if it actually is effective. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Well, perhaps we need to have the business modelling done on that to make it more attractive to the corporate elites to take advantage of. If only. So, look, we're coming up to the last 5 minutes. So if there is any sort of cheeky last questions, type them in. Otherwise, Antony, obviously this is like a really, it's a heavy topic. We're in the midst of this crazy world, and we always would like to kind of try and end this on a hope. Actually, before we go to that question, Hilary McPhee's asking a question, which is actually kind of a hopeful question suggestion. Do you think a citizens' assembly might work here, as they're springing up in Ireland, France, Germany, and maybe the UK? And maybe you could kind of go on to where's the hope in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, possibly. Obviously, depends on what it looks like, and the makeup, and who's involved, and where it is, and yes. But I do think that. I think on certain issues, it's going to be far more effective than in others. I mean, there's certain issues, certain corruption, certain institutional problems, which is so built in. I'm not saying they can't change, but they would need serious, I think, institutional shifts. And also, I think, societal shifts. I mean, one of the things that does give me hope, and let's still end on something, is the global protest movement awakening in the wake of the killing of George Floyd a few months ago in the US. Now, people have been protesting racial injustice for years, as everyone will know. But something, for whatever reason, it's sort of hard to pinpoint why particularly that video, as shocking as it was, triggered this huge global outcry. I don't know. Like, it's always hard to know, what particularly was that event? Why was it? I guess it was the moment, COVID, Trump, possibly. There is a serious push, and I think it's been much more effective in the US than it has been here, I might add, in various places, to seriously reform the ways in which the state addresses violence, the amount of influence and power the police have, the ability for them to shoot and kill and ask questions later. Those conversations have not happened here as much. There's been protests here, which I've supported, and conversations, But when was the last time you heard any serious pressure on police departments, who, yes, here are not killing black people as widely as the US, but there are still lots of black people dying in custody. I think about 440 in the last 15, 20 years, if I got my numbers correct, since the Royal Commission in the early 90s, that we are still in Australia really far back, I think, from that debate. I'm not idealising what's happening in the US. The US clearly is currently a shit show. There's a COVID pandemic out of control. There is a election campaign which I fear is going to end badly regardless of who wins. So I'm not idealising America by any means. But I do think in some parts of the US, the debate around racial justice is far more advanced than it is here on a mainstream level. And there are lots of reasons for that, I guess. So that does give me a degree of hope that there is a possibility and an ability to at least raise these issues. And I wanted to finish on this point, is that one issue here that I think hasn't got much traction yet, and I know it's starting to get more traction in the US, is the serious issue of reparations. Like, reparations is not simply, you've been abused for 250 years, here you have $1,000 check. I'm not suggesting that. Like in America, the question, just for those who don't know, reparations around the issues of slavery. So people who are impacted, which is virtually every black person in the US, there's some conversation and debate about what reparations looks like. What does that mean? There should be, as someone just wrote about the drug war, reparations around the drug war. And this is not just a financial thing, although it has to be part of that. The general issue of holding history to account. What does it look like to have it? You can't, in my view, seriously move forward as a society until or when you address what's happened in the past. It's hardly a revolutionary idea to say, but I think on the issues, it was in Australia, for example, around issues of slavery, which we did have, and despite what Scott Morrison said, and what can only be called attempted genocide, unbelievable amounts of brutality, the White Australia policy, stolen generations, the list goes on. I mean, let's not forget, as much as I supported Kevin Rudd's apology in 2007, he made a particular point to say there is no money attached, which to me was shameful. Now, again, I'm not saying money is the solution to every problem. It's not. But if you believe that simply words are enough and words are important, they're not. They're not enough. And as much as the debate is important, it's vital, it's not enough. There needs to be actual action in policy and, I would argue, financial reparation. And that's something I think Australia has a long way to go. And that conversation cannot and should not be led by someone like me. I'm not for a second suggesting that at all. It needs to be led by people who are much more engaged in that movement, particularly, obviously, black and brown Australians, not someone like me, but something I think about. And I think that debate should be much more front and centre.
Well, hopefully this conversation everyone who's on this conversation or on this call now can take this, what we've talked about today, and go out and have those conversations with other people. I always lean on a quote that Auntie Sheree Malamu told me. She's a South Sea Islander Indigenous woman leader, and she says, when we all speak, when we can speak the truth together, we can all grow up together. She's such a wise woman, so we need to keep having those conversations. But look, we've come to the end. That's gone really quickly. It's 2:00. Antony, thank you so much for coming along and being our first Media Stockade Doc Lovers Club lunchtime gathering, and thank you to all of you for coming along. And I see we've kept most of you on the hook, so that's a good sign.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for everything. It was really great to chat. And if, as I said, people can find my work online, it's all available. Check it out. Buy 50 books. Don't go to Amazon. That's the message.
We'll send you all an email just with some links of Antony's website and where you can get access to more of his work. And also just wanted to remind you that the film link is going to be active for you all for another week. And yeah, we'll also let you know about the next one. We're going to have our next one in October, and it's going to be on the film Palmeri, which is a film about the the first Papua New Guinean women's rugby league team who went to the World Cup, and it's a really lovely story out of Papua New Guinea. So we'd love to have you all along there. So thank you again, and hope you all have a lovely afternoon, and hopefully see you next time, and stay in touch. Oh, and also if you do have any feedback, please let us know. We'd love to really refine these things and make them as enjoyable and interesting as possible. So we'd love to get your feedback on how the event was run. So let us know. All right, lovely to see you all, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.